So our next section here, we're going to be talking about definitions of abuse. And our next speaker, I've had the privilege to get to know better over this last year and a half or so. And what I love so much is to hear his passion when it comes to being an advocate for victims of abuse, along with his wife, Claire. He is a digital production specialist by trade, and he's a father of 6 kids, which I'm not going to try to name. But it's been a real pleasure to get to know him. And let's welcome Peter Roise.
Thank you, Michael. Oh, yeah, you can tell I'm a real pro up here, too. So, good morning, everyone. I am so glad to be here today. Doing this conference is a dream come true for my wife and me. No, really, it is. In the last 5 years, our world got turned upside down. I will not go into the details of that story, and believe me, you can be thankful about that. I'm just going to say it was complicated, and it was also quite real. I will tell you, however, that in the middle of the craziness that we've been through, I came to the strong conviction that abuse awareness was key. I looked at all the different things that could make a difference, and it seemed, and still seems to me, that helping as many people as possible to recognize and respond to abuse is the most significant thing that I can do, which is why I am so happy to be here today. So let me say a quick word about awareness. Pardon me with the microphone here. I'm gonna get it right. I want to achieve something. My goal is to achieve for abuse awareness what has been done with seatbelts and cigarettes. Seatbelts. There was a time when cars didn't have them, right? And now we all know that when we get in the car, we put on our seatbelt because we're safer that way. Cigarettes. Everybody did it, right? Now we know, some of us still do it, but at least we know it's probably not the best idea. So I like these examples because they are examples of a cultural norm where it was changed by an increase in public awareness that in turn changed opinion and then brought about an almost universal change in standard practices. And that all happened in a relatively short period of time. So we need that with abuse. I want people to know what abuse looks like. That's a basic. We should know these basic things. It's hard to find sometimes. We're going to talk about that today. It's not always easy to spot abuse, but we should know what it looks like, because once you do know what it looks like, you can see it. It's not impossible to see. We should also know it's not okay or normal. One of the reasons that sometimes people might think it's okay or normal is because it's hard to spot. It likes to look like something that's normal. It likes to look like a regular relationship. And we need to know where to find reliable help. One of the biggest problems we have is that when people do actually reach out for help, they sometimes don't get it. They go to somebody who doesn't know. So if you all can learn, you can be a person who knows, then they'll find that reliable help. So it's really important for us to raise awareness, and that's really what I want to do here today, why I'm excited about this. So, what is abuse? We just watched a video with people on the street trying to answer the question, and we got a wide range of answers. I thought there were a surprising number of good answers in those interviews. Abuse is common enough in our everyday lives that most of us have some idea of what it means. Yet I think when asked to put our finger on what makes abuse different from other kinds of relationship dysfunctions, we can find ourselves somewhat at a loss. A number of people in the video also acknowledged this as well. They recognize that abuse has different faces, or that it can be hard to tell because in different situations it looks different. And they're right about that also, because like I mentioned, abuse likes to pretend to be normal. So it isn't surprising that at one level, abuse is in fact a twisted version or a bent version of what a healthy relationship is. And that's another way in which it kind of tries to look like normal. So let's start by taking a look at a basic definition, and then I'm going to move on and talk about a contrast. I'm going to describe what abuse is in a series of contrasts between healthy and abuse. When I highlight that contrast, I think we're going to learn some things about the nature of abuse that have already been touched on in Aaron's talk earlier, but that I think we can talk about a little bit more. So, definition of abuse. The improper use of something or a cruel and violent treatment of a person or animal. Now, this is just the definition that Google gave me. St. Google, everybody, right? We love St. Google. There was one other definition on here that I did not include because it didn't apply, but I need both of these in order to make the point that we're making today, talk about relational abuse. The first definition is more general, but we need that because in the early stages, abuse doesn't necessarily look cruel or violent. I think it still is violence to someone when you manipulate them or control them, but that doesn't always look violent. It doesn't always look like cruelty. So that improper use of something helps us cover that other end of the spectrum. When it comes to the cruel and violent treatment, we're going to talk today about domestic abuse, and we're going to talk about child sexual abuse. Both of those things are cruel and violent, and it is an important part of what we're doing today. Another thing that I would add is that for the most part today, we're going to be talking about patterns or patterns of abuse in relationships, or abuse or relationships that are characterized by abuse. So the distinction here is that all humans are liable to engage in an abusive behavior, that manipulation or that control. We do that. That's not something that as soon as you've done it, you've become an abuser. It's something that we can all slip up and do, and it's not a good thing. It's not good. We should move away from it. But the good news about it is that it tends not to be progressive, and it isn't systemic or systematic. Whereas when you're dealing with a pattern of abuse, those are usually driven by beliefs or entitlements and justifications. And when you see a pattern, when it's actually happening in a purposeful way, when it's happening more than once, that usually is going to get worse. You should not assume that it's going to go away on its own, and it is systemic or systematic. So for today, when we're talking about abuse, we really are talking about that pattern of abuse more than we are talking about those abusive behaviors. Of course, we all want to learn to turn away from abusive behaviors as well, and this will be helpful. These conversations will be helpful for that as well, but that is not our focus. All right, so a definition can only take us so far. Like I said, I also want to describe abuse, not just define it. Before I actually jump into the definition, though, I have one more important distinction to make. And I want to describe the difference between healthy and normal. So normal is what we're used to, what we assumed because of the way we were raised or because of the people around us. Oftentimes I think that normal is unhealthy, but we just don't recognize it. Healthy is something that we forget to look for. We look at our own experience, and if it's good, we say, well, it must be healthy. That's a real trap. That's one that I've experienced myself. If it's not good, I think maybe we look around and we find someone who seems like they have it figured out, and we call that normal. And think that that's healthy. Essentially, this means that we define healthy not by understanding the purpose of our relationships or measuring meaningful results. Instead, I think we do a quick guesstimate of how many problems most people have and where we fit on the spectrum. And if we're somewhere near the middle, we would say that we're normal. In reality, that can be very misleading because it's like our physical health. We're not all given the same constitution with the same set of external factors. So I don't think we should judge whether or not what we're doing is healthy or whether or not someone else is healthy by what it looks like on the exterior. That's one of the things that's definitely true in abuse is you will see something that looks like they look like a perfect family, but appearances can be deceiving. So the bottom line is that healthy should be normal. There's a reason why we want to associate the two. We wish that healthy was normal, and so that's why we sort of automatically do that. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the case, and that's why as we go through this description, I'm going to be very deliberate in saying healthy and not normal. I'm not describing normal relationships because I think normal is a term that's too confusing. We're going to talk about healthy. So, with that in mind, let's look at a series of descriptive contrasts, and they are not all going to be up on this screen here, but you'll see a reflection between most of what I'm saying and what's up here. So with that in mind, with these descriptive contrasts, I need to say one more thing, and that is that these descriptions need to be seen in a big picture context. Abuse unfolds over time as a systematic pattern. So no one single snapshot of a relationship will tell a complete story. That's one thing to be very clear about, that if you see a snapshot, you could just be in that phase of the abuse cycle where it's actually called normal. So don't look at a snapshot, you have to look at a bigger picture over time. So let's do these contrasts. If a healthy relationship is made from mutual companionship, abuse prioritizes the emotional needs of one party at the expense of the other person. If a healthy relationship has room for ongoing disagreements or discussions as part of the differences between people, abuse insists on agreement with the truth of the abuser's point of view. If a healthy relationship would be for mutual encouragement and support, abuse is praise and comfort being for one person in the relationship rather than the other. If a healthy relationship has a balance between existing family, friends, and your partner, abuse asks you to abandon all your existing relationships to, quote, be with him. If a healthy relationship is for learning, both parties learning from each other, abuse is one party always being forced to learn from the other. If a healthy relationship involves each party growing to appreciate the differences in the other, abuse is making the other into the likeness of myself, helping her to learn what I like, to like what I like, and not taking time to learn what she likes. If a healthy relationship empowers both parties through teamwork and a bigger world of connections and opportunities, abuse takes freedom, options, and power away from one party for the benefit of the other party. If a healthy marriage is a relationship for loyal, consistent, and mutual romantic affection and exclusive sex, abuse is disloyal, inconsistent romantic affection, and a double standard in sex, where she must be exclusive, but I am allowed a porn habit, a mistress, or to sleep around. And finally, if a healthy relationship is for protection, stability, and comfort, which I think they are, a healthy relationship is for protection, stability, and comfort, abuse is a place of exposure, instability, and fear. And here we come to the great tragedy of abuse. Relationships require vulnerability. If you know what I like and dislike, you can use that to hurt me. And if you are what I like, you can hurt me even more. If you use that power to hurt me so that you can get what you want or think you deserve, you are not only robbing me of what I justly expected in this relationship, mutuality, loyalty, and freedom, you're teaching me that the vulnerability that is required for healthy relationships is not safe. I'm going to say that again. When this happens in a relationship, you're not just robbing me of what I expected in the relationship. You're teaching me that vulnerability that's required for healthy relationships is not safe. And that abuse begins to poison all of my relationships in that way. So, what do we learn from those that set of contrasts? I think you can see that on the abuse end of the spectrum, the person is diminished and their voice is restricted or removed. And on the healthy end of the spectrum, you can see that people get better, they grow, they're empowered, their voice is heard and honored. I want to know about the other. That's the contrast that shows up to me. I'm a photographer. I love contrast. I compose photos. They said I was a digital production specialist. Well, that's a fancy word for photographer, videographer, and I make websites. And if I can make something with a computer, I'm usually pretty comfortable trying to do that. So I'm a photographer. I love contrast. I compose photos for contrast, and then in post-processing, I add more contrast. Contrasts are what make it possible for us to see things. Sometimes working on a landscape photograph, I'll go in and increase the contrast in a localized area, and that will bring out the textures in the land, and it will really make an area of the image pop. So out of those contrasts that we've just described, what pops out? We started to talk about that already. First, I would say that the first thing that pops out to me is that abuse is parasitic. Abuse acknowledges and feeds the needs and desires of one party at the cost of the other. There's a power imbalance. Abuse takes away the personhood or the personal power of the other. In a healthy relationship, each party gets help and growth from the teamwork that is part of good relationships. The world of each partner is bigger because they are together. In an abuse relationship, the abuser grows, but he grows like a snake who has just swallowed a lunch that's a little too big for him. Think about that for a second. The second thing that pops out to me is that abuse removes the power, that personal power, by silencing the voice of the other person. Praise and encouragement can only go one way. Criticism goes the other way. The voice of the other is restricted or removed. There's usually a double standard, and that is protected by silence and secrecy. There are usually an enforced secrecy. The duty of protecting my reputation is usually one of the favorite topics of the abuser. And it's especially true when he's misbehaving. One of the most important manifestations of personhood is voice, and abuse takes away that voice, like we've already talked about. So the two things that I really want to focus on are up here. We've already talked about them a little bit. That's voice and person. If you only take one thing away from this talk, I hope it will be this. Abuse removes or degrades the other person, restricting their power or agency. And one of the main ways that it does that is by removing the voice of the other. Voice and person. We see this tendency arising in ourselves even. Most often I think it happens when we are in an argument or a conflict with a person or a group of people. There's a constant temptation in that context to repackage what they're saying, and turn it into something that they didn't actually say. And then we can quickly reject it as ridiculous. And ridicule is a very common way of removing the voice of the other. People in abusive situations experience ridicule. We also stop seeing another person as someone with legitimate experiences or important concerns, and we welcome name-calling, stereotyping, and other methods of discrediting the humanity and personhood of the other person who disagrees with us. And we do this as groups. We just went through an election cycle. I think you can probably all realize that that is one of the primary things that happens in that context. We want to see the other person as not a person. If we can turn them into a set of beliefs or a stereotype, then we can reject not a person who looks at me, a person I know, a person who might actually breathe the same air I breathe, might actually have the same desires that I have, but somebody who's just crazy. So that fight for person and voice of the other is not just out there, it's close to us. It's in here, really. So those contrasts between healthy and abuse show us that abusers remove or restrict the voice and person, but they also give us an understanding of something else too, and this is where it gets really exciting for me. They show us what healthy is. So let's take a look at healthy. Healthy relationships. What do healthy relationships do for people and voices? They give honor, they give power, they give options, ability to grow, confidence, maturity. The voice is heard, it's viewed as a gift. What is your voice in my life? It's a gift. You're talking to me, I'm listening. Do we listen? We got to listen. It's honored, it's treated as important. And when we don't understand, when we're in that conflict situation, it's pursued to understanding. If I don't understand you, I shouldn't try to find a way to, or if I don't agree with you, or if I don't understand you, I shouldn't find a way to stereotype you and dismiss you. I should try to understand. Let's get to the point of understanding. If people in a relationship are doing that, you can make progress. So when you look abuse in the face and you recognize what it's doing, you learn some things about healthy. In the high contrast moments when you are facing the trauma of abuse, you can see things that didn't stand out before. In my life, it took me seeing someone systematically taking away the voice and agency of another person to realize that healthy is the opposite of that. And from those moments of clarity comes an awareness that makes me passionate about empowering and giving voice to those around me. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I forget and fall into a coercive attitude or behavior. But seeing what I've seen has given me awareness. And that means that I recognize those attitudes and stand up to them in myself and in others. And I also make a positive effort to use my voice on behalf of others and to honor and empower people. But what does God think about this? We're in a church after all. How does all this fit into who God is? What does he say about people and about voices? To me, this is where the rubber really meets the road. I don't have time to go do a thorough study, obviously, but let's just take our example of God's intentions by looking at the beginning. Beginning is a pretty good place to start, and I think it's a good place to see what the purpose of God is in the world, because that's where he started. That's where we first know what he did. In the beginning, God created a man, Adam, in his own image, and he made him a living person. Adam is a person. He's the first person, pretty important. And God made him in his image. I think that makes him very important. God made Adam in his image, and the first job that he gave Adam was to use his voice to name the animals. That sounds like a pretty important job. And God was teaching Adam, and I think he's teaching us, that our voice matters. Abuse is the opposite of our God. He makes people, and he gives them an important voice. Abuse reduces and removes the person, and restricts and removes their voice. Abuse is, in essence, a process of decreation. And he didn't just make the world and stand back and watch from afar. He entered into our story, and he interacts with us routinely and continues to show us how much we matter. If the eternal God, creator of the universe, says that we matter, how can we say anything else? God's word on this is clear. Persons are very important. They are to be cherished, honored, and empowered. Their voices matter. He wants us to pray. He wants to enter into conversations with us. If God wants to hear me, to hear from me, I should be willing to hear my neighbor. We want to give voice. And when we despise the voice of the other and take away their personhood, we are dishonoring him and his purpose. That's not what we're for. That's abuse. And we need to stand up to that in ourselves and in others. So, what's the takeaway? God loves the world. He sees us and loves us. More than that, God hears us. Our voices matter to him. In that context, how can we not be passionate about seeing the other and be happy, eager to hear them? So this is why I wanted to talk to you about what abuse is. I'm passionate about both what it teaches us to stand against and what it has taught me to stand for. When I saw a voice in a person being systematically taken away, it put a fire in me to stand against that. And that is not just out there. That potential is present in each one of us. That's what I hope this day will bring to many of you. I hope that you will see a picture of the ugliness of abuse that will create a contrast. I hope that contrast will show you not just what to stand against, but what to stand for. And I hope that you will see the other person and honor them because God has created them. And I hope that you will hear their voice because that voice of the other speaking to you is God's gift to you. Not just when they agree with you, but all the time. Thank you. So throughout the day, I'm going to be helping to moderate questions, but for myself, I'm going to moderate my own questions. So we'll see how this goes. This is the first time we've done this. If you have questions, you can text them to the number right down here. We're collating and trying to make sure if there's similar answers, they are together, also that they're clear. Isn't it nice that we have little keyboards in our pockets now where we don't have to scribble on a piece of paper and I have to decipher what you said. Now I can just know what those words are, as long as you spell at least halfway decent. So, here's the first question. I recognize bits and pieces of abuse behaviors identified here in all relationships, including my own. How much is too much? So, I don't think I would say it's a much versus it's not an amount thing. It really has much more to do with whether or not a relationship is characterized by mutuality, It's another thing that we showed in that contrast is there a problem with you both being destructive to each other? Are you each shutting each other off? That would be an indicator to me that you have a problem. You have a problem you need to address. It might even be a pattern in that case, but it's not a pattern that results in that imbalance. So the imbalance to me is one of the key indicators that the pattern is something that's actually destructive of the person, and that's why we're looking at the big picture. It's a little frustrating. I can't give you a real simple, straightforward answer, but I think that hopefully takes us in the right direction. Let's try another one. If abuse is abuse still abuse if it only happens once? In the case of a child abuser, if it's not systematic, would that also be classified as abuse? Well, this is a really good question because yes, the answer is it's a serious crime whether it happens once or it happens many times. Now, how much it participates in a pattern of abuse and how damaging it is will be affected by whether or not it happens multiple times. But the fact of the matter is you don't get to that kind of an extreme behavior accidentally. And so it's very rarely alone. That's the first thing to say. It's very rarely alone because there are many, many different scenarios, and I'm sure it's happened, sadly. There would be an event where it would be all alone. It's still a crime. It's still very serious. It still needs to be addressed. It's still very damaging. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an overall pattern. And I think maybe without the rest of the context, it'd be hard to comment on it more than that. Hopefully that's helpful. 1 Corinthians 7 says that the wife does not have authority over her own body. Does that mean her husband has the right to use her body however he wants? Oh, there's a good one. Hey, I got an answer from the crowd here. Yeah, if it comes to a power play, they're at a stalemate. Have you noticed that? The rest of the passage does say that the wife has control over his body. So if he wants to use this, she can tell him, no, I have control over your body. Sit down on the chair. I'm going to tie you up. Yeah. Okay? So that's not what this is for. That's the reality. That's not what this is for. This is to show us that we're supposed to have mutuality, right? Is that pretty clear? It's pretty clear. If we have a stalemate, then we have to figure out how to cooperate. This is the passage that tells us that a husband and wife are like the people who are chained together. They have to work together. Like if you want to go one way and I want to go the other way, we're not going to get anywhere. We actually have to work together. Okay, I think I could do another one. Thank you, Donald. That was perfect. No, you're on it. What if my relationship feels good and normal some of the time, but not always? Oh, that's a great question. I love that question. I should also pay attention to how I'm doing for time. Oh, we're doing fine. Good. Okay, so this is a big question. It has a lot of different ways to go. First of all, feels good is a pretty broad question. Sometimes a relationship feels bad because I have bad expectations. I expect my wife to be something that she's not meant to be or that she can't be. And so that might be my fault. It's possible for a relationship to be just disappointing and not be abusive. And I want that to be really clear. So if that's why you don't feel good, and that happens some of the time, I would encourage you to, work through it with a friend and work through it with your partner, or this could be a question about a relationship that's not an intimate relationship, but I'm assuming that it is. The other thing, though, that stands out to me about questions like this is that sometimes these are feelers. People are actually in an abusive relationship and they want some help. And their voice has been taken away, like we've said. So the first time they ask for help, it's not going to sound like he hits me all the time and he's really violent during sex. They're not going to say that, right? That's not where they can start. That's not safe for them to say. So a question like this, I'd want to hear more about it. I would ask another question. I would say, describe to me how this when it doesn't feel normal or what doesn't feel good, what's going on? Can you tell me more about that? How does it feel? And you're not going to find out everything the first time you talk to somebody, but the more that you can be a safe place for them, the more that you can listen to them, you'll be surprised how quickly they will find the confidence to tell you what you need to know. And the reality is, a normal up and down in a cycle of abuse, that will, even abusive relationships have a good period. We're going to learn more about that later on, so I don't want to steal the speaker's thunder that are coming after us. But the cycle of abuse is really important, and I'll give you the rough outline because it won't hurt, right? You'll get a review later. So if you think of a cycle, it starts maybe at an abusive event. After that abusive event, somebody blows up. Here's a favorite of mine, one I had never even imagined before I actually ran into it, is somebody punching a wall next to your head. That happens. Maybe some of you have experienced that. But it's an intimidating behavior. Did he actually touch you? No, didn't touch you. Did he terrify you the first time he did it? Absolutely. So that behavior is, let's say that's our abusive behavior at the beginning of the abuse cycle. Well, the next day there's a hole in the wall. And he recognizes that he lost his temper. So he says he's sorry, I lost my temper. I shouldn't have made a hole in the wall. I shouldn't have intimidated you. So that's the remorse phase of the cycle. He did that, there's a remorse phase. Then after that, he's doing better. There's no abusive behaviors for a while. That's called the calm period. Then there's a buildup of tension where, things aren't going the way he expects. The dishes are not done as often as he would like, or, you just don't want to do it as much as he wants to do it. And he's getting mad about it. And the tension is building up. And that's building up to finally the breaking point, which is the abusive behavior, the next intimidation event, and then the cycle starts again. So the main reason to point that out to you is to say that there will be an ebb and flow even in an abusive situation. If there's an abusive behavior, it's not that every single moment of every single day is horrible. It's also not that abusers never say sorry. Some of them never do. Just want to say that. I've run into that too. Some abusers don't say sorry, but many of them do. So just because he said sorry doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. And it just takes more questions to find out what's actually going on. Okay. How do you stop a pattern that is 17 years strong? Huh. Wow. I think it's the same process, and so I don't know. I mean, I definitely feel insufficient to this question. I'm not going to pretend that I actually know. I'm going to give you my best input. Take it for what it's worth. A pattern that's 17 years strong. There's also more questions to ask about that. What is the pattern? What does it look like? How often does it happen? All of those things are features of how bad or how severe the situation is. I think the consistent thing that I want you to know and that I want everyone to know about abuse is that, as far as we can tell, the best information from the secular world and from Christians who work in this field is that the only way to stop abuse is with consequences. So that's not an easy answer. We wish that wasn't the case, I think, in some cases. But the reality is consequences are what stops abuse. That means that if there's something criminal going on, you should talk to the police. If it's not criminal, you should get whatever level of authority or any power that you do have in the situation involved to try to change the situation. Now, I jumped ahead a little bit because the reality is with a pattern that's 17 years strong, you're probably not very strong yourself. So one of the first things that you might need to do in that context is spend some time getting strong yourself with an advocate. I would recommend some of the people out in the lobby talk to people about what could be done to do that. There's a lot of good resources out there for helping you to prepare to bring the consequences, whatever they are, that are needed. But the reality is, I don't know of any other way than consequences. Okay, next question. If a pastor or clergy person, is a pastor or clergy person obligated to report abuse to government authorities? Okay, The quick answer is yes. Mandatory reporters, everyone is a mandatory reporter. There is a pastor penitent exception on the books in Idaho, and I do not completely understand it. I also believe that if you read the statute, it sounds like it's fairly strict, like there has to be a very well-defined pastoral relationship, and what is revealed actually has to be very much in the context of a counseling session, sort of a confessional a confessional context. So where somebody is confessing to get something off their chest. In that context, there is a protection for pastors that they don't necessarily have to report. But the statute is written in such a way that I believe it looks like it has to be kind of specific like that. The reality of what actually goes on there is probably something to talk to a lawyer about, because I believe the precedent out there is probably a little bit more lenient towards pastors not having to tell. And that is something that I think should change. I think pastors and clergy should have to report to government authorities, and they should be held to consequences when they don't. Okay, next question. How can you support people who are being abused without bringing on more abuse or hurting them yourself? That's a good question. Of course, they're good questions. My wife is the one who's organizing them. Nice work. She was sitting over here before, but she's back there now, so I pointed the wrong direction. Apologize about that. Okay, so support people who are being abused without bringing more abuse or hurting them yourself. Well, probably the first thing to do is to be a good listener. This is good news. It's easy. As a matter of fact, I've been astonished, very pleasantly astonished at how much healing can come to somebody by just listening to them and believing them. So when somebody wants to tell you what their hurts are, don't try to fix it right away. Don't try to search out all the details and make it make 100% sense instantly. It won't. They're hurting. They're going to let little pieces of it out at a time, and the most important thing to do is listen. Listen and be reassuring. The other thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you do not. I love this question for this reason. One of the things that we always want to do as Christians is when somebody brings an accusation against somebody else, we want to go and confront the person they accused and say, hey, she said this happened. What happened? Okay? Recognize the danger and the place that abuse puts people in, okay? Because if you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to bring down that abuse on her or on that person. So one of the worst things you can do in an abuse situation is immediately confront. Now, the confrontation will have to happen at some point in time, but just recognize that be careful here. Resolving a conflict between husband and wife when there's a question of abuse should be something that you figure out if there's abuse there first before you go and do the confrontation. Hopefully that works. Let's go to the next question. Love covers a multitude of sins. At what point is outside intervention required? What type of abuse makes divorce okay? Okay, well, that's a big question. I don't know if I want to be on the record about what makes divorce okay. I'm gonna edge up to it though. Let's do it this way. So, it goes back to the slide about how it's progressive. If you have a pattern of abuse, it's not going to get better. It's not going to go away. Love covering a multitude of sins is for us to live with one another with grace. And I absolutely believe in that. We don't live in a world where I should be calling you to account for every single time that you said a word that wasn't perfect. Or I shouldn't be calling you to account because you were short with me that time. That's the kind of multitude of sins that love covers. And it can cover bigger things too. I'm not trying to say that it can't cover a big sin. But when it comes to a pattern of sins, a pattern of abuse in a marriage, recognize that's not going to get better on its own. So if you don't stop it, if you don't intervene, it's just going to get worse, and it's going to get worse for you, for anybody else that's in your life, your kids. We're going to hear some amazing testimony in just a minute to this effect. So intervention is required if there's a pattern. That's the quick answer to that. What kind of abuse makes a divorce okay? Here's what I'm going to say about that. If you have an abusive pattern, you need to bring consequences in order to make sure it stops. And one of the most potent consequences that a wife or a intimate partner has is to separate. So separation is an important tool. It's not the only tool, and it isn't a tool that always needs to be used, but it is one of the most important tools. So separation to make the change is a first step, or is a tool that can be used. And in the context of that separation, I think that the reality that divorce is likely if change doesn't come should be in the picture. So abuser should know that if I don't change, this separation is permanent. So I'm not trying to say if it makes it okay, but I'm telling you practically how we would deal with it. And it looks like I'm over time on questions. Did you want to do one more, or should we just call that good? One more, okay. A good final question. This is fun. Thanks. They're working on it. Almost there. I think we might even be like 5 minutes ahead of schedule. Okay, if you shouldn't immediately confront, is that different with child abuse? Oh, that's a good question. No, it's not different. And here's the reality. I'm assuming this means child sexual abuse, because that's what we're talking about today, not just regular child abuse. Child sexual abuse is a crime, okay? And it is not your job to arrest people. It is not your job to investigate crimes. There are people that do that. They're called the police, okay? So you shouldn't confront. You should tell the police. That is what you need to do. The police, if you go and confront, you could ruin an investigation. You might hinder justice. So it's a quick, easy answer. Tell the police. Don't confront. Let them do it. Okay? Thank you very much. We're going to have a break now, and then we'll be back here soon.